And I'm Sheri Kruger. I'm a member of the Michigan World Organization of China Painters, as well as the Michigan China Painting Teachers Association, which is who is bringing this educational program to you today. Um, my goal today is to share with you some of the information I know about using resist or masking products. Talking about resist or masking, and the term masking is used in many of the alternate art forms such as watercolors, etc. But in porcelain painting, we tend to use the term resist because the product we use is called resist. So with that, I'm going to put you looking down at my workspace. So the product that we typically use is called Red Resist, and it is a product that is a water-based product. So it works very well with any of our oil-based wet grounding or dry grounding techniques or other techniques. But the key is they have to be oil-based. You would not be able to use this with a water-based medium because it doesn't work and you get a really big mess. Red Resist you can get through Maryland China, which is the one that I'm holding here for you to see, among many other sources. The other thing I like to use, in addition to just using that with a brush, I also use this applicator, this fine line applicator, fine tip, and I am not getting any promotions by sharing this information. I just want to put that out there because many of the things I have here, you all will be surprised to know, are from Amazon. And you can get this fine line applicator fine tip through Amazon. It typically comes in a package with a second one that looks the same. That is, I think, a medium tip or something. And what's really nice about this is it is a fine line, and I'll be using it later and showing you more. But if you can see here, it actually has a very fine needle that threads into the funnel, the nipple, whatever you want to call that, of that, so that it doesn't dry out on you. I've probably had this resist in here months, if not longer. So again, Red Resist is a water-based product that you can only use with oil-based mediums. In addition to Resist, there are other masking mediums that you can use. One of my favorites is called a vinyl tape. And as I've mentioned somewhere in today's production, I'm a little bit OCD. So you can see I have a variety of widths. I happen to like the 3M product. I have some other vinyl tape, and what I find, even though these vinyl tapes are all similar in age, the 3M maintains its adhesive ability without getting gummy on the surface of it. So again, these were bought on Amazon. The other piece that I like about the vinyl tape is that it can be curved. And I'm going to show you an example of that. I'm going to turn over this for the sake of this. So let's say you had a circle, and I'm not going to use that little black circle I have drawn there because that would be too small. But if you stretch your tape out, you can actually kind of create a curve with it, which you can't do with your masking tape, right? If you did that with your masking tape, and all I'm doing is, kind of following whatever pretend line I see in my brain and pulling it around and then holding it and stretching it so that it's more curved on the inside, right, and stretched out. And then I'd have to work to get rid of that little crease there or clean it up after I did it. So that's one of the nice things of using the vinyl tape. In addition to the vinyl tape,
Recording in progress.
there is also just our traditional masking tape. So masking tape works very well, but you're going to be doing straight lines. I think a lot of us use this, to like mask off a border. And you've got a real straight line. You want to make sure both with the masking tape or the vinyl tape that you press down this inside edge. Otherwise, your paints will weep under it and you get kind of a not nice torn parchment look to that. Um, in addition to the vinyl tape, there are also vinyl stickers. You can see, I think there's a black fleur-de-lis and then the outline of the black fleur-de-lis. And both of them work beautifully. Years ago, I was doing a piece of irises and I used this fleur-de-lis as the border around it. Um, since the fleur-de-lis is based on an iris from the royal court of France, if you want a little history. Um, in addition, you can get stickers, and I apologize, the one I had available that was commercially produced is very tiny, so I'm hoping you can see that. The key if you're buying stickers is you want a laser cut because that's what's going to give you that very fine detail. In addition to, the one that I pulled off and you could ground around the outside, you could do the same thing by cutting off the silhouette. I'm just going to cut whatever one is there. You could cut the silhouette similar to what we've done here and lay that down and pounce inside of that with whatever you are grounding. So those are the different methods. All of them have to be removed before you fire. None of these are designed to be fired in the kiln. I know some people will find paper stickers and use them and just put them on, ground around them, and then fire without removing them. I haven't had a good result with that. And I'm not sure why. So I can't speak to how well that works because it doesn't work for me. So I can't really tell you how to do that part. So those are the different ways that we can mask or resist areas of the porcelain we're working on so that when we do grounding, the grounding area does not occur there. So when I'm doing wet grounding, there's a variety of product you can use to do the grounding with. And I'm going to show you some finished things that are done with that. This grounding that you're seeing now, which is a red ornament, was done with a scratch out technique. So I used a quick drying water-based medium, completely grounded it flat and solid, and then scratched out my design in that. So that's one type of scratching and grounding. Here is another example. This red one was actually done with a cadmium. So if you ever have cadmium colors, it's a great way to use some of those bright cadmiums because you don't use any other paint with them. So they don't get contaminated and you don't have to, figure out all those kind of idiosyncrasies. That's this second design, I literally is an example of where I use the tape to mask my design. And I literally just tape the ornament down to my porcelain, to a porcelain tile, did the black wet grounding, let it dry, and then scratched out my design. Um, and then took my tape off and then did pen work to mirror that design to give you that butterfly appearance. In addition to traditional porcelain paints, which are the two I just showed you, the mineral-based paints, what I'm showing you now is a flat grounding of a metallic or silver white. I'm hoping you can see that sheen. I'm trying to move it around. There you go. Yeah, just so this is done with metallic paint and again, the water-based medium. Another option is to do grounding with a matte paint. And this is a really pretty technique if you did like a flat matte ground and then used a white raised paste type of medium to give you a three-dimensional look. But this is just matte. And as you can tell, you really get a very rich, dark surface to paint on. So in addition to those, then you would go into our lusters or our metallics to do grounding. And In this example, it's just a ruby luster that is grounded onto the base and the top of this ornament, and then some pen work to enhance that. Um, in this ornament, I'm hoping you can see the difference between on this surface and this surface, kind of the flat surfaces. There was a um, underlay that mats your porcelain, put on first, fired, and then liquid bright gold put over that. Obviously, gold was a lot cheaper then. Liquid bright gold was put over that, but I had protected this curved frame. And so you can see the contrast between the matte gold and the liquid bright, very shiny gold. So those are all different mediums that we use in porcelain painting that you can do grounding with. I do not have an example of underlay that you can see. There's many different products you can use. There's one that's called white velvet that a lot of etching, scratching out was done with, and then you would apply a liquid or a mother of pearl over that. There's a yellow product that's just called underlay that has been around for ages that is used under liquid bright golds. Some people use yellow, just traditional yellow brown paint. You may, or depending on your application, you may or may not get a really smooth coat, and then that's going to be reflected on top of the, or when you put the liquid bright gold over, right? Unfortunately, liquid bright doesn't mask anything. It only enhances it, good or bad. So as I mentioned, all of the resists or masking products have to be removed before we fire. Um, so some of the materials I've used for grounding and the ones that I prefer, I'm going to share with you, and then I will demonstrate. The one I've probably spoke about most today, because I think almost everything here except the liquid bright and luster I did with this, is your fast drying water-based medium or drying water-based medium. Um, I happened to get this from Held of Harrogate. They've gone out of business. They are now Held of Holland. It lasts a long time. It says to shake it, but there's no sediment, so I have to admit I never shake it. So I use that in partnership with water, and I'll demonstrate that in a little bit so you can see kind of how I break that down. Um, from there, we would go into our water-based, or I'm sorry, our oil-based grounding mediums. The one I use most often is just balsam of Copaiba. I use dark or light. It really is just whatever bottle I can find in my painting room when I want to do that. Um, Other options, there's a product called MX54. It's a slow drying product, but it does work very nicely for mixing. Um, this is from a supplier in Canada, but again, you can find that at many of the traditional porcelain supply houses. Some people use variations of fat oil, and I actually brought two different ones because I think they're interesting, and I'm hoping you can see this. If you look at this bottle, and if you can see the air bubble in the bottle, you can see how fluid this fat oil is. It just is very liquid, for lack of a better word. Whereas this fat oil, you can see is very thick, like easily as thick as honey, whereas the other one is not. They're both fat oil, right? They're both evaporated turpentine. It's what they are. It's just how much they have been evaporated. Um, when using those products, you would mix it similar to what I'm going to show you with the drying water-based medium, is that you would, you mix it up to a point and then you're going to dilute it with just straight turpentine. I won't be demonstrating that today. I'm going to demonstrate the balsam of Copaiba and the drying water-based medium because those are the two I use most often. Um, so first, what I'd like to show you is how I apply resist. And I would love to tell you I get the credit from this, but I don't. Um, When they apply their resist to their painted area, so we have a painted area and we want to resist the subject matter that is painted so that we can ground outside of that area. So for today, we're going to ground this little red spot because, or black spot, because I originally had it done in red Sharpie and realized that's not going to show up very well for resist. Um, but when you're grounding or when you're applying your resist, if you stay just a hair inside the area you're resisting, so that what that accomplishes is it doesn't give you that hard stop that you often see with using resist. So, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish this little circle. And you just want to do leave a fine halo. So for those of you who have done any cake decorating and piping, it's a very similar feel to using a stiff buttercream frosting that is not warm so that you can make those really pretty roses and leaves. Probably the hardest part of this whole process, and I don't know if you can see this on the camera, is rethreading the needle into the nozzle. And then what I'm hoping, I'm going to lift this up and what I want you to see is there's a very fine black edge outside that resist circle. And I don't know if you can see it or not. I apologize because, yeah, I don't know what color would have worked. So but those are the two products. If I'm doing a large area, what I often will do is use that applicator to almost, like trace the outside edges of my design. And then I will fill it up with a brush and resist, just using the jar. A friend of mine out of Maryland, Lena, recommended these brushes. They're from Amazon again. You'll be so surprised. What's kind of fun is they are bright colors and they come in a pack of 4. So, I mean, you can go to town applying your resist. And they rinse easy. They're a synthetic brush, so it's very easy to clean them out. But any brush is going to work. You just have to, you're using a water-based medium. So you need to use a brush that you can wash out in water. So typically you don't want to use the brushes that you're using oil-based China paints with to apply your resist. Although I think many of us do because we forgot our resist brushes and that's what we have when we're painting. So you pick which one you don't think you're going to use that day. So that's how I apply my resist. I've shown you a couple of ways previously how to apply tape. If you end up working with stickers, typically you can peel them off and just pop them where you want them. If you have a Cricut or a Silhouette, they're both a craft cutting machine or drawing machine. I only use it for cutting, so I'm not sure what else it accomplishes. And you buy the sheets of vinyl, you want to use the ones that are replaceable. And the reason I say that is if you use the vinyl that is made to be almost permanent, when it is time to take that vinyl off after you have ground it, if you know any profanity, you probably will be using it because it is very difficult to accomplish and you just wrestle with it. So again, when if you're working with sheets of vinyl, make sure that you get the ones that are removable. If you are working with a luster and you've fired your luster and now you want to put a resist on it, if you take a drop of turpentine and run it over all the area that you might be applying that resist, you don't want it thick. It just leaves a fine oil base to that. It lets you remove that resist when it's time, without a whole lot of headaches. Because again, if you've ever put resist on luster without putting turpentine down first, If you know profanity, you probably will be using it by the time you're done with that process. What I'd like to do now is to move on to doing how I mix my product for grounding. Um, like many of us, I have a lot of paint. So today we'll be working with Copin Blue because it's such a lovely color and it's darker so we can see it. I'm going to move some things just quickly out of the way so I can get this. So I have a tile. I have my dry paint and I have flux. Um, so what I like to do is mix it to a ratio of 1 to 5. So 1 part flux, 5 parts paint. Other people mix it to 1 part flux, 4 parts paint, any ratio from there. The advantage of adding the flux is it helps the porcelain sink into the glaze more. Um, Flux is already in our paints. And its purpose is, again, to open that glaze on the porcelain to allow the paint to sink into that glaze. So I'm going to mix, and the ratio I use for water-based grounding or oil-based grounding is the same. So I'm going to actually do 1 pile of dry paint, and then we'll mix part of it with water-based and part of it with oil. So years ago, one of my teachers, a lady named Phyllis Norton, taught me that you kind of make this, I don't know, wafer, right? Get it kind of lined up the best you can, and then divide it into 5. It would be so much easier to divide it in 4, but no, we're going to do 5. So you kind of got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you can see I didn't do that really great. So your goal is to kind of get a visual feel for how much flux do you want to add. So I want to add the equivalent of that 1/5. Um, so powder flux is available again through any of your China supply stores. Unfortunately, it's white, so you can't really see it. It's not rocket science. I mean, you don't need to get a measuring spoon and go, okay, I got 5/4 teaspoons of paint and 1/4 teaspoon. I mean, it's not that particular in this case. And I admit to being OCD, but I don't go quite that far. And then you just mix it up so that it's well dispersed among itself. Um, and today, because I'm actually going to use from the same pile for both the water base and the oil base, I need to do a better job than I probably would do in all honesty at home. Whoa! And like our powder paste, right? Or paints, it goes airborne quickly. It's not something you would want to work with in a drafty area. Like often in my painting room, I might have the fan on. I would turn it off for this because it would blow the paint around. So if you look really closely, I'm going to pull this up closer to the camera. You probably can see fine little specks of white in there. That is the flux. Um, I'm I'm not going to work that hard to get that dispersed. It will break down when we mix it in the water base. So I'm going to put some over there for oil and some over there for water. And we'll go this way. It's about half, right? Um, so for the water base, I'm just going to pull that forward here so I can kind of keep it in its own little pile. Again, I'm using a water-based drying medium. There are some different water-based mediums that do not dry, and I'm not familiar with those, so I can't speak to how those would work with wet grounding. In the United States, I know that DBA doing business as has a drying water-based medium. I think Maryland might now. They're becoming more common. Marcy Blantenberg carries it. So you can find it. You might have to do a little bit of research if you decide this is something you'd use. So I make a well in the middle and just add some water-based medium. Again, it's not critical how much you use. As I mix it, I may need to add more. If I think I have too much, I I won't add more paint. I will just have to dilute it. Won't have to dilute it down as much with water. So I'm carefully kind of, incorporating that all together. It's kind of weird because I think you can see some black coming up from the um, gray paint particles in the blue-gray color we're working with. It's kind of interesting if that shows up in the video. Um, so I'm aiming for a consistency pretty similar to what I would paint with if I was going to paint, right? It'll stand up to a little bit of a pile. So that's kind of where I'm aiming for. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move to water, and then I'm going to dilute it down with water. Where how much the medium plays in this and water is the more water you use, the thinner the density of the paint is going to be. I don't want that, so I don't want to go too thin. And I'm just going to add some drops of water um, and break it down. Now, this doesn't dry so quick that you don't have some time to work with it. If you've ever done any grounding with either like a sugar water or the non-diet clear sodas or the milk non-dairy coffee creamer, those dry pretty quickly. Once you're ready to mix that, you need to be ready to move. You wouldn't let it sit here in a pile for a while. I can leave this sit for a little while because now I'm going to talk about what I'm going to use for an applicator. I'm going to show you some of the different applicators you can use, and then I'm going to show you which one I prefer. So there's always our traditional paintbrush that there. Just a flat square shader in whatever size would be appropriate for whatever surface you're applying the resist to. We have our traditional pink sponges. For some reason, I hate to use these for this kind of thing because I want to save them for the really good stuff. So I don't tend to use that. A lot of people would buy, those makeup sponges. You get 100 in a bag at the dollar store for whatever the going rate is today. When I'm using these, what I would probably do and have done is I'll try to get it into a thing where I don't have an edge hitting the surface of my porcelain, because unfortunately this edge will leave a mark when you do grounding with it. So I don't tend to use that anymore because we have better things. Then there's this thing, which is a hoot. It's a finger sponge dauber, Dauber. It's from Amazon. I know you're surprised to hear that. These work very nicely. The only downside for me to these is the porousness, and I don't know that you can see this. The porous nature of the sponge does leave a little more texture than I prefer. So you got to work a little harder to break that down. But I do have those. They're kind of fun. There's also the very classic sea sponge, which is always a lovely product to use. Again, I tend to save that for the things I do that I want that kind of texture. If you've ever used a sea sponge to apply gold along the edge of a product, it's kind of fun, right? Because you get that really pretty, you'll get like the solid gold rim, and then it will fade away to just the little dots or holes that are left by the the texture of that sponge. So I don't use it a lot for the purposes of wet grounding as much as applying other things with a sponge. So my preferred method is, and I'm going to move this out of the way. So the product I prefer is working with, it's called a pre-wrap sponge wrap, pre-athletic sponge. And the original purpose of it is to wrap an athlete's um, skin and before they tape it to stabilize that joint for whatever athletic endeavors they're participating in. Football players used it a lot. And apparently, they don't like having their hair pulled out of their leg so much. So they pre-wrap it with this sponge and then put the tape over it. It it is a very, very fine porousness to it. I mean, I think you can see the silhouettes of my fingers, although you really can't see the actual holes per se if I just hold it flat. What I do with that, you can usually find that anywhere where you find sports wraps, is I cut it long enough to basically fold it in three. I don't know why three. That's what they taught me, so that's what I do. And then I use just a piece of sponge. Some people use fiberfill. Years ago, I had a coupon to Joann, so I went and bought a 1 inch thick upholstery sponge, and I just keep cutting off of that, and there will be some left someday when I'm no longer painting. I I place that in the center, and then I wrap it up like a little dumpling. And at that point, you can hold it like that, just kind of twist the end and hold it. But I don't know about you, but my hands get tired. So I just use one of these little clips and slip it on there, and it just stabilizes it enough that I don't have to hold it so tightly for my own purpose. Um, so that is the sponge I prefer to work with most often. So when I'm looking, I'm going to go back to my wet grounding now. When I'm working with that, what I want it to do is move a little bit. And you can, I don't know if you saw that. It did move a bit, but I would like it a little thinner. So I'm just going to add a little water again. If you think you get it too wet, you can just let it sit a few minutes. It'll evaporate. This is the tool. When I'm using it, it's very similar to any other wet grounding technique, the water base. I'm going to first get a surface on my tile that I like. I don't want to go from this pile of paint there over to here. I want to get it smooth here on the sponge so that when I move to my surface that I'm going to ground, it will just ground very nicely. What I tend to do is kind of start in the middle and then work out to the edge of my design so that I don't have to go over and over it. And it gives you a pretty solid cover without worrying about chipping. Now, I would want to be careful that, and I'm going to see if I can make what I don't want to have happen. So if you had seen me, I just kind of like scraped up some paint there because I don't need any more of that paint, right? I've shown you this. And then I'm going to just put it down. And what I don't want to leave, and this is regardless of if you're using a water-based medium or an oil medium, is a sharp edge that is built up a little bit, almost not a puddle, but if you could see this, and I don't think I can see it. If you look at the surface of the wet grounding to the porcelain, it is smooth. Whereas if you have a puddle, it actually has a little edge to it that almost goes straight up from the porcelain and then down. So if you can see the puddle right up here, here, that's what you don't want. So as you know, right from earlier, we added flux to our product. our paint before we mixed it. The flux is what helps open up the glaze, but so flux in China painting world is some type of a glass, is my understanding. I am not a scientist, but that's my understanding. And glass is cool during firing at different temperatures, popping or flaking off. That's what's happening. You have two different rates of cooling after you fired, and they create a tension in that glaze and they flake off, right? Sometimes we want that. And we have seen beautiful things where we flaked off the glaze, and sometimes you don't. The bummer is when it happens when you don't. So that's how to use the water-based medium. It is drying already. And the nice thing is once it is dry, it doesn't, you can't disturb it easily. Now, I have a knack of when I'm painting and if there's a little something there, I flick it with my hand and your fingernail will scratch it and then you'll end up with a scratch in it, and that's a bummer. Um, so now I just want to kind of move this over to the side and we're going to mix up what is left of the paint and flux with an oil-based medium. So as I mentioned earlier, I prefer to just use balsam of Copaiba. Can be dark, can be light, can be thick, can be thin, doesn't really matter. Um, the nice part is if you're using the thin balsam, whether it's dark or light, you don't have to thin it. It'll be fine. If you use the thick, you probably most likely, depending on how thick your balsam is, will have to go into it with a terp to thin that down. So when I'm mixing this, it's very similar. The consistency I'm looking for in this situation is the consistency I had in the water-based one that was just before I applied it. So you can see that the paint with the balsam added to it just rolls probably like heavy cream. Um, so in this situation, I'm going to use one of those paint daubers. I would most often just use the sports wrap that I've showed you before, but I'm hoping maybe we'll be able to see um, kind of the texture that this leaves behind and then what options. So I'm going to move this over to the side and bring this in. So when I'm in the same way that previously, right, I want to fill my sponge up so that I get a very even application as I pounce on this. I think these were originally designed for stencil painting. Remember when it was real popular to paint on walls or they'd have that stiff brush? I think that's what it's from. So you can just work your way around. Again, I'm going to go from one edge and kind of follow my design, not all over. Um, and I'm just looking for a nice even coverage. Now, the risk when using a stencil like this is that you get such a buildup of paint that when I take this stencil off, and I'm going to try and make that happen and see if we can see that, you can get too much paint. So for me, this would be good. I have a nice even coat. Um, it looks good to me. I would be done. I could let it set for a while, let it dry, or I can remove it now. What I'm going to do next, don't do. What I want to do is get it really thick so that you can see that heavy buildup that I talked about, right? And that's going to be on the right side of this fleur-de-lis. So I'm just going to pull this vinyl off. Um, Mhm. And then you got to figure out where the vinyl design is in here. I got part of it, but I left some. And this is where, like needles and really fine tweezers come into effect. And the advantage is if you had let it dry. And well, we won't go there because that's not really what I want to show you on this example. Um, can you see this part of this fleur-de-lis right there? Can you see the thickness and kind of the texture of it?
Yep.
That's not what you want. That's what not to do. Because it's a very sharp, clean edge, and that's the look you get when using stencils, which is great, right? It's the look you desire. But the problem is, if you get it this thick, it has the potential of popping on you. But that's how I do the wet grounding using the oil base. I can do the same thing with water base, doesn't matter. Another reminder, when you are using a brush with the water-based medium, you need to use a brush that doesn't have oil in it. So you either have a dedicated brush for that, or you get some soap and water, wipe out a brush, and then do it. On the other hand, when you're applying your oil-based grounding, you can take any brush from your box of brushes and paint with it, and it will work. You don't have to worry about that, right? Because the oil or, what little bit of residue of oil that's still in your brush is not going to fight with balsam or any of the other oil-based products, whereas the oil and the water base would fight. The last thing I want to share with you is if you are doing a grounding that you want a really strong, solid application of pigment. I'm sitting in front of you, I hope. Yep. Right, this is the matte that I had shown you earlier with the purple. This is the black. One of the things you can do is you can apply your water-based medium first, just like we did here, let it dry, and you can see that this is dry to the touch. Something had fallen on it over here. I think I mentioned to you that, to touch it is fine, but it does scratch. So you don't want to, and I don't have long nails, but if you happen to scratch over that, it will scratch it. But the other thing you can do, so I have a dried application of my water-based medium, and then I mix up using the same formula, right? The 5-to-1 paint to flux. But now I'm using over on this pile is my oil-based medium, what I used to ground the fleur-de-lis over here. I can use that medium, get a nice coat on my brush. So you can see there's a nice, it's not dark, but it's a nice smooth coat. And I can actually brush over that, and I'm going to stop. Now you don't want to play in that, but hopefully what you can see is the difference in value between where the water-based medium is by itself here or here versus where I applied the oil-based medium on top of that. So basically you're getting a 2-for-1 application instead of having to fire. But the key is you don't want to disturb what's below it, hence don't keep brushing it like I just did, because you can actually see a spot, and I'm not sure how dry this was, but it will disturb the water-based medium application if you play in it. It's really a one and done. Get a nice load on your brush and just lay it down, and then take it away and leave it. And that's it. That's actually what was done with both of these, and neither have had any popping problems. Here's an example of where I resisted an ornament I had that has holly and berries and ribbon and bells on it. So We can ground over resist. We can wet ground with only our oil-based mediums. Because if we went into our water-based medium, remember I mentioned, um, red resist is a water-based product. Um, so this would be another example, and I don't know if you can see this. When I applied this resist, can you see just little hints of the outline of the subject that I put the resist over? I mean, I can remember to only use your oil-based grounding mediums, and then before you fire, remove that resist. Where I find things are Maryland, China, Dallas, China, DBA Originals, I think I mentioned. A Painter's Collection has some of the different products. Held of Holland, Bergman Luster's a great source for lusters. Amazon has some of the things I talked about. They actually have balsam of copaiba now as a essence. So that was, I've not bought it to know how that works. The foam I used is called a pre-wrap medical foam under wrap. There's a mouthful for you. And then finger sponge daubers were the little um, fellows that I used here. So hopefully you learned something new today, or it reminded of something you've heard before or forgot. Thank you for joining us. And that's it. Thank you very much.